is up next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to rise in this place and speak in favour of our Opposition Day motion to expand the pause on home heating to all forms of heating. The goal was to lower costs for Canadians as they prepare to heat their homes for the cold Canadian winter ahead. Unfortunately, and unsurprisingly, this government continued in their staunch refusal to accept common-sense solutions being brought forward by opposition parties, which would result in much-needed financial relief for struggling Canadians. However, today, we have another Opposition Day motion, and this House has another opportunity to do the right thing and vote in favour of our motion to help our farmers. Mr. Speaker, the very straightforward motion reads that the House call on the unelected Senate to immediately pass Bill C-234, an act to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act to remove the carbon tax on the farmers that feed Canadians, as passed by the democratically elected House. Allow me to give you a little bit of background. These private members' bills, sponsored by members from Huron-Bruce, was sent over to the Senate in March of this year, with all parties in support of the legislation except the Liberals. Every single opposition party with status, in addition to the two Greens and two of the three independents, all support this legislation. Support from across the political spectrum, save for the one party that seems hell-bent on staking their political future on a deeply unpopular and deeply flawed carbon pricing scheme. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to point out that this legislation support transcends jurisdiction, too. Several premiers have taken the unusual step of throwing their support behind this legislation. Premier Ford said this legislation would help farmers in Ontario and across Canada by lowering their costs, which would help lower the grocery bills of hardworking families in need of extra support right now. While federal government has finally admitted that the carbon tax is hurting families by pausing its tax on home heating oil, all Canadians deserve a break right now, he suggests. This includes removing the carbon tax from all forms of home heating and passing Bill C-234 as soon as possible. One farmer in my riding wrote, "Grain drying and heating for livestock barns for young livestock has come a long way in efficiency, but we have no alternatives. Heat pumps cannot be built large enough to be effective. Hopefully the Senate can move C-234 forward without further delay. This government has used multiple unusual procedural tactics to stall it." I hear these same sentiments repeatedly, whether it's at a hockey game, a local event, or grocery stores in the riding of Hastings, Lennox, and Addington. Mr. Speaker, given the unique nature of this Opposition Day motion, this speech is as much for our friends in the upper house as it is for Canadians here at home. Recent media reports have indicated that flaring tempers and procedural games have reared their head in the Red Chamber, and it has attracted the attention of the provinces. Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan touched on this unfortunate development. He writes, "The House of Commons recently took an important step in the direction by passing Bill C-234, which would exempt agricultural producers from paying the carbon tax on natural gas and propane used to dry grain and to heat and cool farm buildings like barns and greenhouses. This would reduce the cost of food production, which in turn would reduce the cost of groceries for Canadian families. I commend all MPs who voted for this bill for taking this important step to reduce the cost of living for the people they represent." It is extremely concerning, Mr. Speaker, that the Senate now appears to be blocking the passage of this bill, which was passed by our elected members of Parliament. While senators are not elected, they are appointed to represent the residents of the provinces they represent. It is unacceptable that the Senate would stand in the way of providing Canadians with a break on grocery costs by blocking this carbon tax exemption, which has already been approved by the House of Commons. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, Premier Higgs of New Brunswick wrote, "I urge you to support Bill C-234, an act to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which is now before the Senate. This legislation would remove the carbon tax from fuels used by farmers in the production of their crops, which would have a beneficial effect on the price of food." The neighbouring Premier in Nova Scotia, Tim Houston, also wrote in support of C-234. The carbon tax has a significant impact on the Nova Scotian agricultural sector. For example, it will cost an average poultry producer an estimated $400 in propane and $1,300 for heating in 2023, pre-exemption, and $2,900 in 2030. Farmers across our country are struggling to deal with the impact of carbon tax on their activities. The pain is also being felt by ordinary Nova Scotians and Canadians with out-of-control food inflation, forcing citizens to skip meals or choose between rent and groceries. Food is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Bill C-234 will save farmers close to $1 billion by 2030 and bring desperately needed relief both to farmers and consumers. Mr. Speaker, there was another point that I would like to touch on that was raised by the member of Carleton earlier today. The capacity of Parliament to raise monies, and more specifically, the House of Commons. The long struggle that this legislature and its predecessors have gone through to secure our ultimate and most basic function to oversee the expenditure of public monies. This was not achieved without the shedding of blood, Mr. Speaker. Lord Durham, sent to investigate the rebellions taking place in Upper and Lower Canada, wrote, "The Assembly, after it had obtained entire control over the public revenues, still found itself deprived of all voices in the choice or even designation of the persons in whose administration of affairs it could feel confidence." He went on to state, "It is difficult to conceive what could have been their theory or government who imagined that in any colony of England or a body of invested with the name and character of a representative assembly could be deprived of any of those powers which, in the opinion of Englishmen, are inherent in a popular legislation." In short, Mr. Speaker, only the House of Commons may propose the expenditure of public funds. The House has been extremely clear in our intentions. We want this legislation passed. To the senators that opposed this legislation, I urge them to take phone calls from their constituents. Listen to small businesses in their provinces. Listen to what struggling Canadians have to say with empathy. Because if they are truly willing to stand against a piece of legislation that receives support from across the political aisle, except from the party that appointed most of them, they are going to have to explain their reasoning. And it's not a very good look, Mr. Speaker. They're going to have to justify the actions of an institution that is supposed to be a chamber of sober second thought, not a blind political ideology. We already know that this government is fanatically devoted to the carbon tax. I hope their political appointees in the Senate can come to some common sense. It is imperative, Mr. Speaker, that all parliamentarians, elected or not, respect the will and the voice of all Canadians. And on C-234, Canadians and their elected representatives have been exceedingly clear. We want this legislation, we need this legislation, and we needed it yesterday. It has been sitting on the dockets of both houses for nearly 2 years. Thankfully, C-234 is in the final stage of the process, and I look forward to seeing this legislation come into force so that the wallets of our farmers and our Canadians at large can finally get some relief. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job. Questions and comments? Question Kamal Tar, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if the member would provide her thoughts on this media report, and I quote, Canadian Senator Bernadette Clement was reportedly forced to leave her home due to fears for her safety. The incident came about after a provocative post akin to a wanted poster was shared online by a former Conservative Party leader, a member from Wascana, Regina Wascana. The post included the Senator Clement's picture and office phone number, triggering a deluge of abusive calls, including racist comments and even a threatening phone call from an unidentified man. She went on to say that her office staff, too, ceased answering the phone in a clear reflection of a heightened sense of fear. She decided to relocate from her Cornwall home to Ottawa. My question to the member is, does she support the type of intimidating factors that are being used by the Conservative Party today being applied to the Senate of Canada?
The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
I certainly disagree, Mr. Speaker. While I do not agree with anyone ever being threatened or intimidated, I do agree with holding the upper chamber accountable. The question I would pose is the intimidation that this member is suggesting is mere distraction. Mr. Speaker, the intimidation imposed by this member of Parliament and this Liberal NDP government on hardworking Canadians is insufferable. So the question is, who's being intimidated?
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, l'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Saint-Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a simple question for my colleague. She made a long speech about the fact that the Senate should respect House decisions. Would she be willing to go over her entire speech and simply replace C-234 by C-282 in her speech, the bill on supply management, and then ultimately make the same point?
For Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the honourable member for her question. My question suggests and remains that Canadian farmers, growers, and ranchers are driving our economy. Bill C-234 is a vote for Canadian farmers, a vote for rural communities, a vote for sustaining farm practices, and a vote for food security. I think that answers the question, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've been listening to the debate today. I've heard a lot of Conservatives talk about trying to hold the upper chamber to account. But of course, you can't, by design, because they're appointed by the Prime Minister. They never face the electorate. Exactly. They serve until they're 75. We've heard complaints today about this particular bill that's being held up in the Senate. We've seen bills, including a bill having to do with the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, killed by the Senate in previous parliaments. We've seen issues, and Conservatives complain, rightly, I think, about the intervention of the Senate in respect to the medical assistance in dying debate. We know the Senate costs Canadians $125 million a year plus. Will she join with me today in calling for the abolition of the Senate?
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would certainly call on this member of Parliament for betraying Canadians, because when he was elected to this House of Commons, he was elected to be the opposition, and instead he's been propping up this government for how long? So I would pose this question. Canadians are catching on, and I'm here representing all people of Hastings, Lennox and Addington, and I would encourage the upper chamber to reflect on their role as they represent. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for her wonderful speech and her great answers. I just want to ask her, while the Liberals and the NDP continue to come here with their carbon tax religion, we're failing to recognize that carbon is actually a building block of life, and it is plant food, and that a carbon tax is not a climate change policy. It's not anything to do about the environment. I'd like to ask the member if she thinks the carbon tax is making our farmers less competitive, less productive, and less profitable, and at the end of the day, creating food insecurity in this country like the Liberals are doing here in Canada, the same as Putin is doing in Ukraine.
The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. What we need to do is we need to make it right for the consumer, we need to make it right for the farmer, we need to make it right for the environment, and we need to make it right for all Canadians. We need technology, Mr. Speaker, not taxes. Nutritious and affordable food right here in Canada is what Canadians are looking for. Food is not a luxury. Mr. Speaker, 800,000 Canadians in Ontario alone had to go to a food bank. Something needs to change.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.